Welcome to the imaginary main stage at the 2020 Conventures Boston Marathon Expo for the seminar series that's been arranged by Conventures in defiance of every virus. I'm Roger Robinson, chair of this session on 3 great running books. Thanks to TK Skenderian of Conventures and to Rosie Spraker, my technical director, who saved me from my terror of the technology, and also to today's outstanding 2 panelists. We wish a great run first, most important thing, to all of you who are running the virtual Boston Marathon. And we hope to see you all at the next real Boston Marathon and its Expo, hoping that happens really soon. Meanwhile, we bring you the authors of 3 books on running that have been called the best of the last decade. Deena Kastor, one of the great American runners, has now published one of the great American running books. Best known for winning the London and Chicago marathons and for her Olympic bronze medal and her amazing American record of 2:19:36, Deena has now produced a New York Times bestseller. Let Your Mind Run, a memoir of thinking my way to victory. Matt Futterman is deputy sports editor of the New York Times, formerly part of a Pulitzer Prize winning journalism team, and author of the groundbreaking book Players, the story of sports and money. Last year, he published a great acclaim, Running to the Edge, a band of misfits and the guru who unlocked the secrets of speed. His bio for Penguin Random House says, in his spare time, he runs marathons. He is not sure why. Well, he might be about to find out. I'm Roger Robinson, the only one of the 3 to break a Boston Marathon record. That's because Deena never ran it. Doing 2:20:15 for the Masters. And I'm also the one whose book has the shortest title, When Running Made History, which had rave reviews from Amby Burfoot and Bob Fitzgerald of New England Runner and other close friends. We'll start with more about our lives, especially our lives as runners, because our 3 books all provide a strong running-related life story. Deena first, as the most distinguished runner among us, please tell the viewers about your life as a runner and how you translated that into book form. Deena.
Yeah, thank you, Roger, and thank you, Matt, for sharing the stage together today. It's once a year that we get to meet up in the great city of Boston, and if we have to do it virtually, it's an honor and a privilege to stay flexible and creative during these times and be together like this. In writing Let Your Mind Run, it took me 3 years. It was a really hard book to write because even though it's a memoir, the entire time from beginning of those 3 years to the seconds before my deadline when I was able to send the book in, I didn't care that the reader learned anything about me. Although it was a story about my life as a runner from 11 years old until now 47. What I really wanted was for the reader to discover more about themselves in reading it. So I wrote from that perspective, and with that drive, every single day I sat down to write, is hoping that the truths and the power, the mental power that I've found, that positivity truly drives performance, great performances, that if people could understand that they also have it within them, they can not only be faster and reach personal best, but live a really much more fulfilling life. So that was my motivation every single day I sat down at this desk to write.
Gosh, Matt, tell us about you and why and how you're in the book. I think one of the reviews, it talks about your uneven or eccentric career in running, some phrase like that.
Well, eccentric is an interesting word for it. Just tell me again, people keep talking about like this virtual Boston. Are we not running the Boston Marathon this year? Can someone fill me in on what's going on?
You are running it. Show up, Matt.
I mean, it's Patriots Day is, I mean, did we miss Patriots Day? What's going on here? Anyway, so my life as a runner, I mean, I think I like to say at this point, I don't really remember when I didn't run. I'm so far and away the slowest person on this panel. And I began running.
Not now, Matt.
Well, I think we'll have to see about that. Anyway, I began running as a small kid, and I remember that first 5-mile run when I was 10 years old, and finishing in 40:15 and beating my oldest brother, nearly beating my middle brother, and it was always sort of something that I knew I could do, not very quickly. But I could always go far. I didn't seem to get tired. And I played a lot of other sports growing up until I kind of got cut from most of them. And, I joined cross country when I got cut from the varsity soccer team in high school. And that was really sort of the beginning of my life as a quote unquote serious runner, but, serious with a very lowercase s, not competitive in any way really, other than those 2 years in high school. And since then it's really kind of just sustained me. It's been the thing I do most days. It was every day for a long while. I've worked in some swimming and some yoga as I've gotten older, and my legs have asked for moments of breaks. But it's really the thing that is as important to me as writing or anything, just about anything else that I do with my life other than take care of my family.
So is that why you wove it into this book, which is actually about Bob Larson and the runners around him, but you wove your story and impressions into that to an extent?
Well, I thought that most people who might be reading this book were going to be like me. I mean, people always ask you, like, who are you writing this book for? Who do you envision as your reader? And one of the readers I envisioned was me. And I'm always sort of curious about people's running story. Now, the characters in this book, Bob Larson and his troops, the first question I always asked them was, why do you run? And that's a question I ask just about any runner I meet, either while we're running or whether we're waiting in a starter tent somewhere. And I'm always fascinated by that story. And so I thought that this would be sort of a device for runners to get into the story, to know the author, to know who they were talking to know that they were talking to someone who was one of them.
Yeah, I did something similar actually, Matt, because my book started with the idea that somebody needed to write a history of modern running, which nobody still has done. This really important social movement. And I started doing that, and then I found two other things kept coming into, kind of getting in the way. One was that modern running has been much more than a sport. It's been a social movement, and it's actually created history in all sorts of important ways. And so then I started to add that dimension to it, and that eventually became the book's title. But the other dimension is I kept writing about things that I'd seen or I'd been involved in and that I remembered. And then slowly it came into my reluctant, inhibited, Brit Kiwi, uptight personality that maybe I should actually write about me, which I'm reluctant to do. And so I wove that in. So what I made it was not a book of complete history, but a book of samples of history, all seen from an eyewitness point of view. So and I've been around running now for 70 years and seen it from all kinds of different perspectives. So I was able to bring all those different perspectives, writing about seeing Emil Zatopek when I was 9 years old. And in that chapter, trying to capture that point of view, or being a stadium announcer and writing the first account of the trials and tribulations of that job and just how hard it is, and seeing a world record from that particular point of view, or being a television commentator and trying to figure out what to say when you're trying to introduce a race where you know that the likely winner is on drugs. And how do you say that without getting sued? So I try and get all of those personal challenges in to make it more than just history. And, you know, I'm quite sure that among the people watching this, there'll be some people who have hit the wall in the Boston Marathon in the Newton Hills. So I'm certainly not unique in that. But I am unique or unusual in that I did it in 1996 in the 100th Boston Marathon, when that race was in itself making history. And I was there with the job of writing about the race and capturing its sense of jubilation and celebration. And there I was, dragging my butt along in utter misery for the last 8 miles of the race. So that personal dimension has I think added to the book, and people have really liked it. Deena, I want to get back to you because you don't get off that easily. You know, I have to say, with one reader, you know, Deena was trying to help readers. And I wrote to her after I read the book, and I said, I have to confess that I tried your philosophy of be happy and be nice to everybody, which is what she advocates in the book. She says, be nice to everybody, be happy when you're running. I tried that. I spent a whole race thinking warm, positive thoughts and trying to be nice to everybody, and it didn't work. I still ran like an 80-year-old with 2 knee replacements. So I was totally disappointed dealing with your philosophy. So I'm your failed reader.
I just want to say, Roger, think of how awful that day would have been if you were just a grumpy old man running through the streets. It would have been far worse, I promise you.
Oh, good. I've reverted to being scowling and self-pitying in all my races, especially the self-pitying. But Deena, tell us, we've got time for one of your experiences, because for me, reading your book, the fascination was getting inside your mind, and you have some of the best accounts of running major races from the inside that I've read. So you did do that, however modest you are about not writing about yourself.
Yeah, but I want to say that as I admire both of your writing, Matt and Roger, and even cherish it, the way that you've written about the history of our sport and the people and the moments in time. Roger, I relied on you even in writing my book, relying on your historical hats with writing about Athens and understanding Athens from that true perspective of the really the history of that marathon and the whether myth or reality of Fidippidi taking that fateful journey into the ancient city. So I really did rely so much on your wise words, so eloquently spoken, to be able to get that part of history so right in the book. So I really want to just say thank you for that.
Yeah, but you did it well. So you must have thought back through those races, because we've all watched you. I mean, you can't, when you're writing about a race, you know, as a journalist, I can write and I can say Deena Kastor came into the stadium and she was wearing a funny hat and, you know, she'd run absolute masterpiece of tactics. But you were able to get your actual thoughts and what you knew and what you didn't know, and things like you didn't even know that you were in 3rd place until you got to the stadium, and you conjured up how you felt. Right. And that's really valuable.
It's, I think, the importance of journaling. I like to journal and document. Some of them are behind me, but I like to journal and document. I keep a very detailed training log, and thank goodness my parents never threw away any scrap of paper. If I was mentioned, even just a mention, an honorable mention at the end of an article, my parents would cut it out and put it in a box in the garage. And so as the boxes piled up over the years from 11 to 40 something years old, I kept saying, get rid of those boxes, get rid of those boxes. And when I realized I was going to write this book, I bolted to their house and gathered up those boxes and put everything in chronological order, so that if I needed to know, you know, read an article to just trigger a memory of how that race felt, I could do that, and then match that with my journals and my training logs. So it was, even though the story was about me, I had to do a lot of digging up just so I could get the mood right, and even how I worked through a lot of the races right. And I think it's so relatable. We could have a race that we reach our goal, but it was really hard to get there. And what did that look like internally, so that people can say, like, gosh, it looks so easy. You make it look so easy. Well, it's not. It is arduous, but with the persistence and the resiliency and all these virtues you try to cultivate throughout the years, they end up paying off when things get hard.
Yeah, and that's true whether you're running a 2:20 or a 5:20.
Yeah, or even chasing your children around the house. Like
Yes,
it always works.
you still had to put the work in, and then it pays off. That's absolutely right. And so therefore the reader can relate to it. And I think what happens is, because we all have our own lives, we're fascinated in other people's lives. I used to teach a graduate course that I called biographical fictions, and it was about the art of writing life narrative. And in a way, we've all done that in these books. We've done it in the context of running, but that doesn't make it any less interesting. And in fact, because we're writing mostly for runners, they have found those aspects of our books really interesting.
I almost see you two as entrepreneurs, because sometimes we don't know what we need or what we want out of a story until we're sitting there just wrapped in it. And I feel like both of you do that with your own writing. It's like, oh my gosh, like who would have thought that the Camille Toads and what Bob Larson created in Southern California would have been so intriguing, to see that it really did launch a new perspective in training, or the history of our sport, to just be connected to it in such a deeper way, so that you have more purpose when you go out there, and see how important you are in the fabric of that running journey, Roger, with some of the writings that you have done. So you guys, I consider entrepreneurs in the writing industry.
Yeah, well, having mentioned Bob Larson, let's go on to another topic and stop talking about ourselves and talk about the other people that we've encountered. Because while our books are all personal in the ways that we've talked about, they're also, all of them, rich in other people. And Matt, your book is essentially about somebody else. It's essentially about Bob Larson and that whole group that he built. So tell us about him and what you were trying to do, and how you populated that book.
Well, for years I'd known Bob basically as, Meb's coach, and knew that he had worked with Deena some, and Joe Vigil in Mammoth in the early 2000s. But that was really all I knew about him. And then I got invited to see a screening of a documentary that one of his former runners had done about him. And I saw it, and they flashed this picture of his first national championship team, which was the Humboldt Toads. And this ragtag group of runners in 1976 that sort of came out of nowhere to win the National Cross Country Championships. And I looked at that picture, and I remember it, like it was yesterday. I remember thinking, oh, I bet there's a book there. And I sort of knew immediately that what I really wanted to do was to figure out who the people in that picture were. They were these, they were essentially this group of like hippie runners. They had long beards and scraggly hair. They kind of looked like the Doobie Brothers. And I'm dating myself a little bit with that reference, but I mean, that's sort of what they were. And I've always been fascinated with that period of running, that sort of late 60s, early 70s, kind of just before the boom, when running was really kind of like punk rock. It was just so fringe and niche, and really one of the craziest things you could possibly do would be to wake up on a Saturday morning and run 10 or 15 miles. I mean, some people still think that's crazy, but at the time, you were just out of your mind if you did something like that. And I love that period. I mean, I love that period in America anyway, because the country was had been torn apart and was kind of build itself back up again. And this seemed like an opportunity to write about the sort of early days of long distance running. And as I dug into it and talked to Bob more and talked to these runners to find out if there was a book there and what made what they were doing different, I really did find out that what they had done was sort of create a whole new way of thinking about training, and what we think about now as the tempo run. And that was really what he had created and what was such an important breakthrough, because there were two schools of thought at the time. There was, you know, the long, slow distance school of thought, which I would argue probably owes itself to another Kiwi that we all know, Mr. Lydiard. And
Yeah.
you know,
Somewhat inaccurately, but anyway.
right, perhaps. And then there was the, you know, the Eastern Europeans and their crazy intervals that they did. And so Bob sort of had this question, which was based in science, actually, and research he'd done as a graduate student at San Diego State, which was, why do the long runs have to be so slow, and why do the intervals have to be so short? And so his whole idea was to, you know, get yourself comfortable with being uncomfortable. Go to your edge and figure out how to stay there, and teach your body how to stay there, and then go for a little bit longer and stay there the next day, and then the next day, and it builds on itself. And like I said, that's what we now refer to, just, you know, haphazardly, as the tempo run. But it really sort of has its roots in Larson's work, first as a high school coach, then a junior college coach, then with this team of, like I said, hippie runners, and then eventually at UCLA, and eventually with, you know, the Olympic team, and, you know, bringing back American long distance running. And you asked him sort of, if you asked him, well, what did you do in the early 2000s to get to a spot where America went from, you know, barely qualifying people for the marathon in the Sydney Olympics to winning 1/3 of the medals, of the 6 medals in the 2004 Olympics. And oh, by the way, you know, those 2 medals were won by one small group of runners in Mammoth, California. What did you do? And he said, well, basically, I just did what we did back in the 70s with the Humboldt Toads, and worked in a lot of altitude training at that. So that was really the story. It was sort of the rise and fall and re-rise of American long distance running, as told through this sort of very largely unknown, except to those who know him well, coach.
Yeah, and just going back, and Deena, we'll come to you in just a second, but to follow on directly from something you said about the tempo runs, probably the first American to do that, though he never got credit for it and got forgotten, was Buddy Edlin. And he is one of the chapters in my book, because he went across to England, where I was at that time. So I was born in England before I moved to New Zealand, and I was sort of rising runner, you know, struggling to get through, and not at national level, but I would see Buddy and got to know him, and we all got fond of him. We called him our Yank, because being an American, it was so unusual in England at that time. And he'd come over so that he could train, and that's essentially how he trained, by doing middle length or middle to long length runs at tempo. And everybody says, if you Google Buddy Edlin these days, you'll find everybody castigates him for overtraining, which he probably did, but he was feeling his way. He was exploring, he was experimenting, and nobody knew where you fell off the end of the world in those days. And Buddy did, and unfortunately, he fell off the end of the world just after he'd broken the world record, which I saw him do in 1963. And before the 1964 Olympics, when he actually went into those Olympics with a faster time than a baby Bikila, because he didn't have the world record at that moment, but Bikila hadn't run that far. So Buddy was a really interesting character, and he's one of the people who I try and kind of bring to life, not in a really intimate way, but try and look at his accomplishment as a runner. And he wasn't, as it were, the leader of that, but he was like a precursor, sort of outlier, who did that kind of work before anybody else in America was doing it. And he did it because he'd gone to Scandinavia and then to England to learn how to do long distance running. Deena, you've got good people in your book, apart from you. So tell us about them. Tell us about your support group and what you did to bring them to life.
Yeah, so I'll just say with Buddy Edlin, because he's very adored in the Alamosa running community, has a lot of family in the valley there, that we still get our honey, even though we now live in Mammoth Lakes, California, we still get our honey from his family's honey farm in the valley.
Oh, great. Yeah. Nice.
So it's just so, I mean, it's amazing to me how we just come come full circle all the time in life with people and experiences that we can always, I mean, I feel like we could share this call for hours and talk about these stories. But the other half of Bob Larson is really my coach, Joe Vigil, who I started working with in 1996, right when I graduated from college. And he is certainly the hero of my book. Everybody that has read it just absolutely adores him, but it's no surprise. And that was probably the hardest part to write, was to make him that adorable, because that's how everybody feels when they meet him. They feel uplifted, empowered, inspired. And that's what he was to me. And I wanted to make sure I got that right. You know, you want to make sure you're getting your characters right. And so for me, he was my entire motivation for writing the book. The fact that that he can, in a given moment, he has no time in his day, but if you ask him for time, he'll find it for you. If you know, he's not in the upper 1% financially in the country, but if you need a cup of coffee, he's going to buy it for you. He's just such an ultra generous person. I've seen him literally take his jacket off and give it to someone who complimented it. And so what he showed me time and time again in the years I was able to work with him is, whatever we have, whether it's time or money or knowledge, even food on the table, that the value of it really increases the moment we can share it with others. And that was my motivation for writing, was that, gosh, if this sport and this man has taught me so much, how can I share it with a broader audience? And being able to write this book was certainly a way to do that.
That's great. In a sport that can seem self-occupied, as it were, you know, because we all have only ourselves to get through the race, it's still at the same time an amazing community.
I think
and
also,
actually these three books have caught that.
I think also one of the things that makes Joe Vigil and you know, at the time his sidekick Larson so special in that period was that there were really no secrets to what you were doing. They were not, you know, the whole sport, or not the whole sport, but some elements of the sport had gotten this idea of, like, you know, we need to all go into our separate silos. And they and your running club were largely open books. If you wanted, it's, you know, as I understand it, you know, if you wanted to know what was going on, all you had to do was drive up to Mammoth and see what was going on. And you'd ask Bob, and he'd say, well, here's the training logs and here's what they're doing. And because he really didn't think it was much of a secret. He said, what do? You run hard at altitude and you practice doing it, you know?
They really did. The two of them together really broke that barrier, because that was really hard, even graduating from college, seeing that, gosh, there's all these people around the country training by themselves. And I wanted to train with a group because I believed they brought the best out in me, just knowing how I thrive. And so the two of them, 4 years after we were training in Colorado, the two of them, Coach Vigil and Coach Larson, Neb and I, coming together in Mammoth Lakes, but really inviting the best distance runners in the country to come join us and have these training camps. Not everybody made the commitment to move here permanently like Neb and I did, but they came for months at a time to train and live together. And it was a really inspiring and uplifting time for all of us, because we just drew the best out of each other. Someone was better at sprinting, someone was better at long runs, but we were all in it together, encouraging each other, because with the pathetic performance distance running had in the 2000 Olympics, my performance included, to be able to get runners on the podium, that's what it took. It took everyone being at altitude, working together, and making sure that people were rising to the top and making Olympic teams and bringing home medals.
That's interesting about the group. I remember talking to the German runner Irina Mikitenko one time in Berlin, and this would have been about I guess 20 years ago, something like that, 15, 20 years ago. And it was at a time when the men's marathon record was crashing down through, you know, below 206, 205, 204, and nothing was happening to the women. And I asked her why, and she said it's because all the top women train on their own and the men train in groups. Now that was Irina's view, and I think there's a lot of truth in it. And I think you're absolutely right that when you look at the great eras of running, Lydiard's Auckland in 1960, in the 1950s and 60s, or Florida in the Frank Shorter, Jack Batchelor era, you know, that time, or the Kenyans now, or your Mammoth Lakes group. There's always, you know, what in the old term I would call a school. There's a school of runners who are both competing against each other, but also supporting each other. And that chemistry is something that's very hard to define. And unless you've been a runner, you don't quite understand it. But it's something that really is the way to race standard. I was lucky when I went to Cambridge University in England, we had what probably was the best university team in history there. And that, you know, I was just an absolute hopeless back of the pack runner, but that really helped to bring me through. You know, there was a guy from Australia with a name something like Herb Elliott, and he only ranked number 3 in our cross-country team. So you know, that's how good they were. And that really raised your sights and made you willing to do the work.
Absolutely.
And how'd you do at Cambridge on that run around the courtyard with the clock and Chariots of Fire? That's not in your book, as I recall, is it?
No, it's not. And they had the wrong college, and it's only done when extremely drunk.
Okay, got it. Okay.
Though I do believe that somebody like Seb Coe or one of that era, I think, did try and beat it while the bell is ringing. So, one idea I had. Would you like to read a bit of your book? I think it's nice if you can just read a paragraph or two, so that people can actually hear what it's like. You know, I've been a literary scholar and I've done a lot of literary festivals, and it's nice when the book actually comes to life. Matt, would you like to lead off and read a bit?
Let me find a spot. Deena, if you have a spot chosen, why don't you start?
Sure.
If that's okay.
I did choose a spot, and I chose this because it's the very beginning, but it was the last words that I wrote 5 minutes before I needed to turn my final book in. So I cried through the whole thing. So because I was having a nervous breakdown, because I thought after 3 years, I am 5 minutes to my deadline and I'm at the beginning. Something's not right. But I sat back and thought, like, what does this all mean? Like, how would I explain this to a reader to encourage them to keep going? And so I took the last paragraph of my prologue. I thought I had discovered the secrets to success, because I had. By identifying the thought that was holding me back and replacing it with a new one to help me move forward, I undid years of self-destructive thinking patterns that had left me unhappy and injury prone. And I built better mental habits that not only propelled my success, but also prepared me to handle setbacks and challenges. Positive thinking had long been considered a powerful life tool, to the point that it's almost become a cliche. Yet its great power emerges when applied as a lifelong process. Changing a single thought improved the moment I was in, but years of dedicated practice changed my career, my life, and ultimately me. All of this left me in awe at the power of choosing perspective, the way it can crack open physical and mental potential. During my career, no one could see the turns of thought, the diligent choosing of words, the monotonous shifting of perspective. Yet it was apparent in my performance and the joy I felt for life. Over the years, I realized that we have it within us, no matter our passion or career, to build a better stage for success. Building a positive mind gives any pursuit surprising ease, lifting one to unimaginable heights. Here's how it lifted me.
Show us the book. Great. Matt, are you ready? Do you want to go next, or shall I go next?
I'm ready, and I thought
Okay.
that since we're talking about Boston, I wanted to read a passage in my book about the 2018 Boston Marathon, which was there was a little rain that day, and I can't imagine it not ever being my favorite race, having survived it. So I'll read a little bit about that. While plenty of Bostonians were smart enough to stay inside, this is supposedly the area with the largest concentration of graduate degrees after all. Tens of thousands came out to cheer us on. And did they ever bring it? Bruce Springsteen's No Surrender was blasting on the speakers as I passed through Natick. You could hear the Wellesley women screaming in mile 13 a good half mile before we got to them. An old college friend appeared to cheer for me on Heartbreak Hill. Hadn't seen her in 25 years. And yeah, of course she lives right off Heartbreak Hill. Then finally, it was our turn for the 6 most beautiful words in distance running, right on Hereford, left on Boylston. I was streaking toward the finish line in Copley Square, airplaning my arms and weaving across the road in delirium. Sure, there was some hypothermia, another deluge, more gusty winds, bring it on. In the telling, which is all I have now and all that matters, it's the best Boston ever.
Nice. Reminds us that running can be serious, and in some cases, in my book, it can be solemn. You know, when I mean, and I'm going to read a bit actually about the New York Marathon in the year of 9/11. But before I do that, just to balance it, let me tell one of my favorite stories, which is in the book, of my first race. I think it was my first race or second race ever in America. So I wasn't used to American idiom, and I just turned 40, so I was hoping to win the Masters. This was in the Hospital Hill Run in Kansas City. Well, in New Zealand, over 40 in those days was called veteran. It was the veteran championships or veteran section. No, Masters is the American term. You can't use vet because it has another meaning. So vet, we were talking about the vet. So I'd started fairly slowly because it was incredibly hot and humid. And I came up through the field, and then I saw this bald-headed guy in front of me who could have been over 40. So I drew alongside and said, in obviously my non-American accent, excuse me, are you a vet? And he looked very puzzled, and he said, no, I'm a computer salesman. And I've always wondered what went through his head. He thought, is this man going to ask for advice about his cat or something?
Did you beat him? That's all I care about.
Yes, I did. Yes, and I did. Yes, and I finished third overall, and my veterans or masters record stood at that race for about 30 years. It then finally got broken. So I wanted to read a bit because it does the 3 things that I'm trying to do in this book, which is tell history and tell how running made history outside running itself, how it was significant, and also give the personal perspective. And this is when in 9/11, Catherine Switzer, my wife, and I were in New York on 9/11, went for a sad run in Central Park that afternoon, and then were there through the aftermath and we're involved because we were both going to be working at the New York Marathon. So involved in the preparation for that. And that race was, well, I describe here just what was significant about it. It was such a success, such a resilient overcoming of difficulty. But for me personally, you know, I had my personal feeling because Catherine was covering the race for the women's lead race for television on a motorcycle sidecar. And we all knew that the big risk was coming over the Verrazzano Narrows Bridge, because that was a kind of perfect terrorist's photo op. And so I suddenly found myself, for the first time really, personally anxious. You know, when you go through a crisis like that, you sort of suppress it, and then it might come through later. And that's what happened to me at that point. I'm also pleased with this bit because nobody, I think, has ever described what a marathon looks like from the spectator's point of view. And in a few lines, I tried to catch that as they came by. So not until they reached Brooklyn would I know that the race, 3,000 runners, and my wife were safe. In an open sidecar, she was utterly vulnerable. Real personal anxiety emerged from wherever I'd suppressed it for the first time since the 11th of September. I knew from Alan Steinfeld about the precautions, the guards, the police divers under the bridge, the observers from the air, but those were anxious days. At last, the runners came flickering up 4th Avenue toward me, with the usual entourage of cops and vans and cameras, all intact, and the leaders flitted past, unbelievably fast, as they always are. There was a glimpse of Catherine's unmistakable hair, flying from under the helmet and headphones, some runners I recognized, the accustomed broadening of the stream behind the elites, the stream turning into a river, then a flood, then a surging ocean of runners, filling the entire road, spilling over the curb, the same old eager mass field, bobbling along, all familiar, my world known, alive, safe, in motion. It is, I thought, as the relief flowed, only another race. Yet it was more. Undeterred by horror and grief, that 2001 running of the New York City Marathon symbolized more than any other single event the resolute continuing life of New York, of America, and of Western global culture after the attacks. 30,000 men and women is a lot, plus the largest spectator crowd in the race's history, and all who supported and reported them. It's no exaggeration to say that they affirmed with some courage that we value the freedoms and opportunities our society provides, including the freedom for men and women to run freely together. So that's a sample of each of our three books, and thank you for those. And I'm a reader, and I like to actually hear the text.
Roger, that 2001 New York Marathon was actually my very first marathon, and it's so emotional to be towing that starting line. But I think because of the spectators and the warmth and the need for New York to regenerate, it was an incredible event, and really, I think the hook of the marathon that made it my sole profession after that. It was really a beautiful weekend of humanity and resurgence, and grateful that it was able to happen.
Yeah, one of the themes of my book is that modern running has, among its many other things, it has a celebratory function, as it did in Boston in 1990, and as it very often does. It also has a cathartic function. Mm-hmm. And on occasions like that, and in Boston in Meb's year, the running of the marathon has a great healing effect, and it's something which is new. There's no other age has ever had this experience of thousands of people running through the streets, and now, of course, we're in this crisis when it can't happen, and we're having to come to terms with what we do about that and how we react to it.
And that's running an important story to tell, because it shows that although we can't join that starting line right now, we know as a running community we're going to be back, and we're going to be back strong and supportive. And with new people running through this pandemic, picking up running for the first time, we might even have a bigger audience to be able to bring under our wings and take out there.
I think that's absolutely right, and this very occasion is an example. I've always said, I say again in my book, that running in that era that Matt, you were talking about, when running changed from being a bunch of weirdos who'd got cut from the football team, little skinny guys that weren't good at anything else, into this mass movement. That period has now led to this astonishing social movement, and it's transformed through that, and it's done by what I call creative energy. Mm-hmm. All of those people at that time, they all went off, and some of those long-haired weirdo people went off and they opened shoe stores. Or Tom Gilligan was a travel agent, and he started a running travel business. Nobody would have thought of such a thing, but he was a runner, and he wanted to, and he was a travel agent, so he put the two. And all round, runners were doing those things, and they were creating magazines, and they were writing books, and they were setting up timing businesses and everything else. And they were doing it while they're also running 120 miles a week. And it was an absolutely amazing era of that creative energy. And what I hope is that running will, and it is showing that creative energy again. Yeah. We've invented this new thing called virtual running. It didn't exist 2 years ago.
I think the larger point that I draw from it is that, we all, it's sort of counterintuitive, because we think of running as this very solitary, individualistic activity. But really, as Deena was talking about before, the idea of a group empowering you and making you go faster and making you stronger. And, if you take that out to the sort of lay runners like me, I think there's just this great desire to be a part of something that's larger than yourself. And, you know, there's nothing that affords that opportunity more than standing on a starting line with 30 or 50,000 people. And Roger, the way you described that sort of river of people coming over there, when when you're a part of that river, you're just in the middle of this humanity. And in some sense you feel very small, but in another sense you feel as big as you've ever felt before.
And there is that amazing chemistry where you may be competing against people, but you're also sharing the experience, and so you support them. And that happens at the front of races. As Deena, you would know this. I was writing recently about the 1936 Olympic marathon, when a Japanese and a Brit who had never met each other and didn't speak a word of each other's language actually supported each other as they worked through the field. And the way that chemistry that they set up was important in deciding the eventual result of the race. And then one of them, when the time came, one of them went ahead and beat the other. And of course, we know that's going to happen. It's right and proper that it does. But that supportive process still happens, and it happens on a much larger scale.
I think
and it's happening now, and we're bringing the community together in ways that when we can't do it physically. Matt, sorry.
That's the biggest shock when people who aren't familiar with the sport sort of read about it or learn about it. I remember my wife reading a draft of my book and saying, what do you mean they work together? How does that actually, they talk to each other, they work together? And I was like, yeah, they're in the race for 2 hours right around each other. They know exactly what's going on. There's gamesmanship, but they're from the same country. They're working together. They're sharing the load. And so I think it's, like I said, it's something very counterintuitive. And that was a big lesson of, the Deena's coach Joe and also of Bob, that you're never, the group is so much stronger than the individual. And that was something that he really drew from the East Africans, which is that they were doing a couple of things really differently. They were running farther, they were training as a group, and they were running really hard. And that was going to their edge and staying there. And that was what made all the difference.
That group chemistry is crucial. And Deena, when you were talking before about how people, or perhaps it's you, Matt, I forget, people went to Mammoth Lakes or wherever, and they were welcome. There were no secrets. That's the other thing about running, is that in that growth era and still now, it's completely welcoming. Somebody shows up at your group, your club, your training, whatever, your tribe, your race. You don't ask who they are or how much money they've got or what. You say, oh great, come and run, and you help them to run. And that's why running was so welcoming to women when they first came in, that running as a sport. No, I never knew any male runner. I mean, what male runner is going to object to having attractive women in shorts running alongside? That's nobody did. No male runner. I never heard any male runner, and nor did Catherine, express any reservation. Officials, yes. Spectators, yes. Society, journalists, yes. But never actual runners. And it's the same. I'm 81 years old now. Nobody ever looks at me and says, "What are you doing here? Go back to your wheelchair." They say, "Oh, great. Here we are. You're another runner, and I'll beat you."
Right. I tell people who might be nervous, or whenever I'm giving talks about the book or running or anything, I say, I swear to you, if you're nervous or shy about showing up, there is not a runner in the world who is just not happy to have another member of the tribe. No one's going to care about whether you run a 5-minute mile or an 11-minute mile. It's just, come on in, let's do it. And, we're just thrilled to have another brother or sister.
Yeah, it has something in common with the church that way. There's individual satisfaction, individual reward and enhancement, but also you're doing it communally in a place that welcomes everybody. And I often say it also has a lot in common with music, as music used to be in society, when everybody played an instrument or was in a choir or something, and you didn't have to be great at it. You just had to join in, and it was part of the way society bound itself together, and that's part of the importance of running. And this event, we're getting towards the end of our time, but this occasion, virtual we might be, but we're nevertheless all together. We're all supporting the Boston Marathon. We're all supporting Conventures and their Expo, and we're looking forward, TK, to getting to your Expo next year and spending lots of money and enjoying the whole communal experience. And I mean, I think we've had a good discussion, and it's one that really reaffirms the importance of running, even in this most difficult time for the community and for the sport. Deena Kastor and Matt Futterman. Deena, have let your mind run. And Matt, I'm sorry, what's it called? I've forgotten your book's title. Sorry.
It's called Running to the Edge.
Running to the Edge. Sorry, I went over the edge. Sorry.
That's okay. A band of misfits and the guru who unlocked the secrets of speed. That's
the one. Thank you. And my book, When Running Made History, which I can still remember. I have these senior moments. Thank you very much, and thanks to Conventures for hosting this occasion. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us, Roger, and for doing this.
Thank you.